I'm Don Davis of Forum News Service. The tradition of grilling the governor and leaders goes back a couple decades and has proven very helpful as reporters prepare previews of the upcoming legislative session. With us, as you might expect, front and center, Governor Mark Dayton, Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, House Speaker Kurt Daudt. We have Senate Minority Leader Tom Bakk and House Minority Leader Melissa Hortman. I want to thank all of you, especially this year. Thank you, Governor Dayton, for coming to so many of these briefings over the years, and this will be our last one, as you know.
I won't even be invited. I'll have to try to fit in the rafters next time.
Maybe you can sit up here and ask a question or two.
Hey, there we go. I like that. That'd be fun.
While I'm thanking people, also want to thank the Senate Sergeant at Arms Office and the Senate Media Services for all they do to put this together. Well, let's start with the breaking political news, which is over on that side of the room, of the table. No, you can't leave, Governor. I want to talk about last night's Senate special election. There was, of course, a House special election too, but the Senate election left that one vote margin. And as you might have heard, there could be a legal case coming back that theoretically could affect that. I always like to start with the governor with my first question in these briefings. So I am going to start with you, but I want to get over to the rest of you too.
No comment.
I want to know, Governor, how you think this one vote margin and the possibility of legal action could affect this year's session.
I mean, I think it's appropriate to ask the legislature, particularly the two senators. You know, I've had my legal foray for this 8 years, and I have a good relationship with Senator Fischbach, Lieutenant Governor. We've had a couple of really good conversations. We're going to work together on senior care protections. So I look forward to working with her in whatever capacity, and it's really for the Senate and then for the courts to resolve the difference of views there.
Since you brought up Senator Fischbach, have you had any dealings with her since she became Lieutenant Governor?
We had a great lunch just for the session. She gave me fabulous banana bread. We shared pictures of our grandkids and our dogs. And we've been working with her on the elder care. She was not invited to a meeting last week where we had the task force set up through the ARP. She was not able to be there because she had to be in court. But we've involved her and look forward to working with her and collaboratively on that and other things as well.
If I may, let me go to Senator Bakk. Are we going to see another lawsuit about Senator Fischbach?
Well, I think there's little time for that before Tuesday. Monday's a federal holiday, so I think let's see kind of what events come about on Tuesday as it relates to Senator Fischbach and her role, dual role as Lieutenant Governor and a member of the Senate. So I think even if somebody wanted to initiate some kind of an appeal, I think the timing probably doesn't provide for anything to happen prior to convening of the legislative session on Tuesday.
If Senator Fischbach goes up front as president, takes a vote, what triggers the lawsuit, do you think?
Well, I think if you look at the district court ruling, they talked about the case not being ripe in that no kind of events have happened. So I guess, and unless something happens where she is actually the 34th vote, where she actually affects the outcome, probably little will happen.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Well, back to last night, it was our hope that we would have flipped a decades-old Senate position that was controlled by Democrats. That may have changed some of what happens going forward, but we know that it's happened at least 7 times in the past that you've had a president of the Senate fulfill a lieutenant governor role for a period of time, and so we're just going to take it as it comes. As you look at last year, it was 34-33, and we ended up accomplishing a lot for Minnesota that I think, frankly, all 5 people here should get some credit for. But it was certainly difficult to navigate, but not impossible.
Would the House leaders like to chime in on this?
I'm tweeting.
Can you pay attention to us and tweet at the same time?
I'll try.
I think the Senate determines its membership, and we'll leave that conversation to the Senate.
He tweeted a picture of the two of us here,
Our
arm in
selfie.
arm. That'll go viral really soon.
You know, I think that we can work together. You know, we've had a 1-seat difference in the Senate through the entire last session. You know, even if the Senate's tied, I think the issues that we will deal with this session kind of transcend partisan politics, and my hope is that we can put that stuff aside and just really work on solving the problems that Minnesotans care about. So I hope we don't get to that point, but if we do, I'm confident that we can still work together in a way that Minnesotans will appreciate.
And first question after mine goes to Mary. And identify yourselves when you ask your questions, please.
Okay, Mary LaHammer, Twin Cities PBS. It's in this vein of being able to work together and lawsuits. Various iterations of lawsuits have had all of you in court for different reasons. I'm wondering about the working relationship going forward. I know, Mr. Speaker, you said you were optimistic, but last week's session briefing was anything but sunshine and light between the legislative leaders. Governor, I would like you to take this, and do you think you can truly, all of you, start fresh and new, despite all of the ill will that was developed between lawsuits and special elections and machinations trying to change control in the Senate? Can we really have a productive session?
Well, I'm certainly want to set all that aside. I've had very good meetings, one-on-one with the Speaker and with the Majority Leader, and of course with the DFL leaders. You know, we're all elected to perform responsibilities that are very important to the state of Minnesota, as the Speaker just said. You know, everybody in Minnesota has a stake in what we can accomplish, which we'll have our differences for sure, but also working together. This whole federal tax bill and the impact on Minnesota, hugely complex, but vitally important. Hundreds of millions of dollars on the line there. We're going to have to work together, or we're going to have a stalemate, and Minnesotans will have an extremely complicated tax forms to be filling out a year from now. So there are areas where the people have a right to expect us to work together, and I'm prepared to do that. I think the leaders have indicated the same, and we should proceed on that basis.
Well, I would say amen to the governor. If we look at last year, the tax bill and transportation bill and Real ID and the stopping the collapse of health care and all the different issues, we were at this forum last year and said that's what we needed to work on, and we needed to work on it together. And I will say, the last lawsuit didn't go well for our side, and yet the governor called and said, I want to move forward. I'm going to, just send me that legislative budget and I'll take care of it. And that is his goodwill going forward. We're going to say the same thing. We have to deal with the federal tax bill. I think that's the number one thing. A number of folks want us to do something related to an infrastructure, a bonding bill, and a host of other issues. And so that doesn't happen unless you have some sense of respect for each other and knowing that we all want to do what's right for Minnesota, and I think we will.
And if I may follow up, the gentleman to your side here, he wants your job. How are the two of you going to work together, knowing that Tom Bakk is this close to becoming majority leader?
I want to say one thing first, because he says his goal is to take majority, and I'm praying it doesn't happen. I mean, it's just back and forth. But even I will just tell you that that is part of what we do and what we fight about. But Senator Bakk called me and said, I don't want this to ruin how we relate together, and that's it's really, really important. But I'm going to fight like crazy to keep the majority, and I respect his desire to do something different.
What would you like me to say, Mary?
Tell him
How about answer the question of how you can relate together when you're trying to take out his majority?
Well, I mean, the Senate is very fortunate right now in that both the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader are Iron Rangers. Probably never had a situation like that before. Senator Gazelka is a very proud former captain of the Virginian Blue Devil basketball team. So that's a good little tidbit of Senate history, but I don't believe that's ever been the case before. I feel like we have a very, very good relationship. I did call him before a lawsuit was ever filed and say, this is just business, and I don't want it to affect our relationship and being able to get work done during the upcoming session. There's a great deal to be done. I think there'll be a great deal of bipartisan work done. My one concern, and one of the challenges of being a leader when you have a surplus, and it does appear like we're going to have a state budget with a surplus on the 28th. The amount of it we'll see, but one of the challenges is kind of tamping down some of the expectations. I worry a little bit that we're going to overcommit either on the tax side or the spending side, and ultimately a year from now, the next legislature and the next governor potentially could be here facing a deficit, because this economic recovery is not going to hold indefinitely. Minnesota's economy is doing better than probably most of the country, but small little dips in economic growth have a significant impact on state revenue. So I just would urge caution. It's hard for leaders because it's much harder to be a leader when you have some money to spend, because everyone wants to get some of it. And so the temptation to spend is pretty strong regardless of who's in charge. So my number one hope for this session is that we don't overcommit on the spending side, on the supplemental budget, and this time next year be sitting here facing a deficit.
Relationship, Mr. Speaker, I'd like you to take it first and comment on the gentleman next to you, because the two of you have been in court as well. What's the relationship?
I actually I hope that people don't think just because of that one thing at the very end of session that we didn't have a very productive and really, I think, a good working relationship through session. And I said this to the governor, and his staff were wonderful to work with at the end of the last session. Obviously, we had a difference of opinion on a couple of things, and that led us to court. But to answer your question directly, I'm very willing to put all of that behind us and roll up our sleeves and get to work. Our personalities should never get in the way of doing the work that people sent us here to do. And I said earlier, and I'll repeat, I think the problem, if we just focus on solving the problems that I think are the biggest issues that face Minnesotans and the ones that they expect us to work on this session, if we focus on that instead of politics and elections and other things, I think we can work together really well, and I think we can be very successful this session.
Finally, Madam Minority Leader, to quote a member of your chamber who says you can't take the politics out of politics, how are you going to do that? Can you really work together?
Well, exactly. The system is designed for there to be conflict. The idea is that the clash of ideas will result in the best compromise for Minnesotans. But people shouldn't confuse our disagreements about policy with personal dislike for one another. I think we all get along pretty well, and we have pretty decent communications. We just have very different views of how to serve the state. Democrats really feel strongly that stronger K-12 funding, stronger higher education is better for the middle class. Republicans tend to view tax cuts as a way to spur the economy, to create better conditions for Minnesotans. So we will, of course, fight vigorously with one another about policy proposals, but that does not necessarily translate into any personal ill will.
So are you all saying you're going to get along this year? We'll hold you to it.
All right.
Open for other questions. Tim Pugmire.
Hello. What is the procedure, the plan for moving ahead with this funding issue to fund the legislature? Is that job one, first day of session? What do you expect?
I can probably take that. I think I met with the governor right before Christmas as well, and the first thing he brought up when we had lunch together was, first day, first week, whenever, pass a funding bill and send it, and I'll sign it. Our intent is not to add anything extra into that bill. Our intent is to just send a bill just the way it was, not to try to, use it for a vehicle for anything else, but just to kind of use it as something to close that chapter. Because we have a level of trust between us, I don't think it'll happen the first day, but it'll be the first couple of weeks probably.
And
If the Speaker would like to pass that budget with any DFL votes, we'll need to have a conversation about what that looks like and the other items of unfinished business that we left at the end of session. We definitely have a point of view of the importance of the work that was left undone and other components that should be included in an early bill.
Senator Gazelka, on that, do you have the votes to pass a clean budget?
We will, but in the end, how are we going to move forward? That's why I would prefer to make it a clean bill. There are some other issues that we've already been talking amongst us about what do we do about different things. And I don't want it to be a Christmas tree bill. That's why we didn't get a transportation bill for about 10 years. That's why we didn't do Real ID for, I think, about 10 years. And so I want to get that one up and out of here, but that doesn't mean there aren't other important issues that we do have to address, and I'm open to addressing them.
Senator Bakk, do you want a clean bill?
Well, I guess I was the first one that raised this. You know, this legislative budget bill will have the impact of providing the resources necessary to give all of our legislative staff, and in the Senate it's a couple hundred people, to be able to give them cost of living increases. The Constitution triggered a provision where legislators got increases this last year. I think right now we've left our state's public employees behind. I can tell you I was incredibly disappointed when the subcommittee on employee relations rejected the state's negotiated contracts for our public employees. It just seems like if we're willing to pass a budget that ends up funding additional wages for legislators, additional cost of living increases for all of the legislative staff, that part of that should be to respect the collective bargaining process between the administration and all the public employee unions and all of the managerial people who are not represented by unions, and get the cost of living increases for them. And I will be advocating very hard that ratification of those state employee contracts be included in the legislative budget. I was pretty disappointed when it was rejected by the subcommittee.
Can the three of you in the middle agree with adding things like this? Governor?
Governor's proposed, legislatures dispose. I've stated my preference for clean bill, but they're right to take their own action on that. And I agree. I don't want it to be a Christmas tree. I'm not going to make it absolute. I want to sign the bill. I want to put it all behind us. I want to move forward.
Senator Gazelka, can you accept things that Senator Bakk is talking about?
I think it then becomes a Christmas tree bill, and that's why I've already committed that I'm very open to discussing that the contract. I think in the end, the subcommittee felt like MMB was not forthright with the data that, since Senator Bakk and I have talked about, might have made it go a lot smoother. But it's a separate issue, and it's one that I'm committed to getting done, but not first week like I think the legislative funding should be.
Quickly, Speaker.
Senator Bakk is one of 201 members of the legislature, and now that we know what that one member wants, we would only, if we decide to go down that path, we only need to find out what all of the other 200 members would each want included in that bill. So I think the wise decision is, and I think, frankly, the best for showing the public that we've repaired the relationship, we're moving on, we're putting this behind us, and we're starting fresh, is to send a clean bill just exactly the way that it was and not add other things in.
Next question. Kevin?
I think this is mine. In Judge Gutzman's ruling yesterday, he said that the constituent had no standing, but he did say that one case that might have standing is if there's a Marr kind of a situation where a bill is passed by one vote and it winds up being disputed because that vote might have been cast by somebody who was not qualified or eligible to be a senator.
Are you suggesting it could be the legislative funding bill? We're not done with this yet?
I'm not saying that, but
we might be in court yet over this.
One place where that might happen is if there is a vote to expel. And in that case, the lieutenant governor herself might wind up being the tie-breaking vote. Is there any possibility that a bill or a vote to expel or to keep Lieutenant Governor Fischbach in the Senate will happen?
So I believe that a tie vote keeps everything as is. I believe that's how it plays out. And so, so in that case it wouldn't matter, but the fact that there likely will be some scenario where the vote will be 34-33, and others will have to decide if they want to take that to court, and what does that mean for the work that we can get done in the Senate. That's the part I can't control. But at this point, we're moving forward until somebody says otherwise.
Senator Bakk?
Well, I don't expect there'll be a motion to expel Article 4, Section 7 of the Constitution says that to expel a member requires a 2/3 vote. I don't think those votes are there.
Esme, you had a question?
Yes, I guess I would like, first of all, to ask Governor Dayton, this is your last year. Are you feel?
Everybody keeps, saying,
Let's go.
don't celebrate until after I leave, okay?
Okay. I'm just asking if you are nostalgic in any way, and also if there are any priorities that you really would like to really focus on in what is your last year, and I do have a follow-up.
Well, I'm too focused on the here and now, frankly, to get nostalgic, or people ask me what I'm going to do in the next year, and my response is I'm going to find a good elementary school, real diverse student body, and I'm going to be a hall monitor. I'm going to high-five all the kids that go by and revive my faith in the human race as a result. So I'm not focused on the past. I'm not focused on the future. We got 3 months now. This legislative session hugely important, and so that's my focus. We get next fall, we'll deal with some of the other aspects.
Okay. And then just for the follow-up, I did look at the selfie. It is a tad awkward, if I may just editorialize here. I mean, could the Speaker and Governor really address your relationship, which has been, quite frankly, publicly played out in a very bitter fashion? And I think many Minnesotans are hoping that our political leaders can work together. What exactly is the status of your relationship, and how is this going to play out or affect things that occur in the session going forward?
Well, I think, as said before, separating the personal and the professional or the political is really important. I have great respect for the Speaker. I like him. We get along well, and we had really good times together, just the two of us talking about everything from our dogs to across the spectrum. We're going to clash. I mean, we have very different ideologies. We represent very different constituencies. Minnesotans are very divided among themselves, and I think it's unrealistic to think we're just going to come and have it all be sweetness and harmony and light. It's not. As Representative Hortman said, the system's not supposed to work that way. It is a clash of ideas and ideologies and beliefs, convictions, and he holds his sincerely, and I hold mine. So I separate that from the personal relationship, which I think is very important.
And what is the personal relationship?
I would agree with the governor. I think we have a very good personal relationship, and we always have gotten along really well. I think we at least I have a high level of respect for the governor, but he's right. We do disagree on issues, and we hold our positions firmly, and we advocate for those positions. So we are going to disagree, but I think we have both tried to do a very good job of separating those two and treating each other respectfully even when we do disagree. And sometimes I'm going to blame you guys a little bit. The media likes to tell the story of conflict. That story sells on your news better than our selfie probably will, apparently. But the reality is we get along very well on a personal level. I've been with the governor fishing on the fishing opener now, I don't even know how many years, and we have a great time. And we usually don't talk about business when we're on the fishing boat. And we do get together for breakfast or lunch on occasion, and we probably during session will do that a little more frequently. And I think those things are good. It reminds you that there's a person there instead of just ideas that you may disagree with.
More questions? Trey. And please identify yourself. I forgot to enforce that rule.
Well, I apologize. I'm Trey Muse. I'm with the Mankato Free Press. I'd like to talk about bonding for a minute. I really have two questions. One, how large do you all think this year's bonding bill should be? And the second is Republicans have criticized Governor Dayton's bonding bill proposal as lacking local infrastructure projects. How much emphasis should local projects have in this year's bonding bill?
Well, I'm constraining myself to $1.5 billion. There's about another $1 billion, as you say, of local government projects many of which are urgent and important. But I'm, again, wanting to keep mine within my boundary. And I think 1.5 billion is a very responsible bill and is frankly inadequate for the scope of the needs. Local government, local issues, higher education, which is just crucially important. We've undercapitalized our higher education, colleges, universities all over the state. Buildings are obsolete. I went this morning to a groundbreaking for this new health sciences building at the university. It's going to make a huge difference in the university's prominence, ability to attract and retain the top faculty, attract and retain the top students. You know, passed in the 17 bonding bill, it's going to open up in 2020. There's a lag here. So if we don't do these things now, especially with interest rates still relatively low, but probably going to rise, if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, we're just sacrificing the future of our state.
Sure. You know, we passed the largest bonding bill in state history last session. This is typically the bonding year. We knew that we were making up for lost time in the previous biennium. I think we did about 173 million, something like that, in the previous biennium. So, you know, to get to that 10-year average, you'd be just a little over 800 million. And I believe that the forecast called for debt service to cover about 800 million. So, you know, if you look at a number like that or south of that, that's probably fiscally and from a reasonable perspective what we should do. But, you know, we're open to discussions on less than that or, you know, potentially more than that if the projects are right. I do want to comment on what the governor said about focusing on state assets. I think one of the problems, we have fallen behind on some of those state assets. And the problem has been that we too often put local projects in to get enough votes to pass a bill. And what that does is it takes from you know, taking care of our state infrastructure the way we probably should have. So I think we as a legislature should have a discussion about should we focus the bonding bills more on those sorts of state priorities.
Leader Hortman, you actually have a say in this one.
Yeah, the single most important thing we can do to create jobs in Minnesota is to pass a healthy size bonding bill. With interest rates low right now, but definitely projected to rise, you know, causing the turmoil on the stock market last week, we absolutely should borrow and build now. Just as a family, when they're looking at when to take out a mortgage, looks at what's happening with the interest rates, this is the time for the state to maximize its borrowing and get those projects underway because they are going to be more expensive in the future for two reasons. We know inflation's coming, and we know interest rates are going up.
Senators, I bet you have an opinion about this, Mr. Leader.
So right away, I publicly said that I'm open to a bonding bill. I thought it should be significantly less than $1 billion, but what that number is part of the negotiation. But I've made it clear that I am open. I think we should do it. I think we should focus on transportation and wastewater infrastructure, and we've talked about maybe there's a solution in there for mental health as far as some of the folks that we don't have a good place for them right now, and how do we solve that. But I've expressed openness, and I'm guessing that Senator Bakk will as well.
Well, there is really kind of an arbitrary number of $1 billion that we don't seem to be able to break. And so let me just suggest let's do $1 billion bill. And then I think we all admit the state's deferred maintenance on all of our public infrastructure, we're falling further and further behind because it is hard to compete with tuck pointing a building versus building a new building or a wing on a building. So, so I'm going to propose that we do $1 billion traditional bonding bill, and then we do an additional bill on maintenance on all of our state infrastructure all over the state. And let's just take the politics out and just all admit we're falling way, way behind. Now, and that includes in the transportation area. And part of the reason for promoting that is if you've been watching what's going on federally relative to Senator or President Trump's infrastructure bill, he is going to rely heavily on states leveraging this federal money. I think we would be wise to pay close attention to that, and there may be an opportunity here with a major maintenance infrastructure type bill that spending could then leverage federal dollars out of the new federal infrastructure bill that's going to be coming. And I think we want to get ourselves in a position where we're able to leverage as much of that federal money that's available as possible. And I think a standalone maintenance type bill might put us in a good position to be able to do that.
It's time for a lightning round. Want to know what each one of you would predict the budget forecast will show. Deficit or surplus and the figure. Senator Bakk, start with you.
I think it will project a surplus.
How much?
Less than $1 billion, and I think, of course, I'm always watching the next biennium because I think we have responsibility to the next legislature. I think the next biennium, I'm hoping to see no deficit and probably just adequate resources for the next biennium.
Senator Gazelka.
I said in November with the forecast that I thought it would be more like $1 billion surplus. I'll just stick to that number.
Governor?
Surplus, I keep looking in the drawer for the Rudy purposes pieces of paper with those, but I can't find it. So I'm not going to predict the number, but I think we'll have surplus this year and the next biennium.
Speaker?
$600 million surplus.
Leader Hortman?
$643 million.
We have an almost agreement there. Questions? At the end.
If we do indeed have a surplus, as you're all predicting, what should the money be used for?
Well, I would say in the last session, we were incredibly light on the higher education bill, and we were light on the E-12 bill. We have districts all over the state borrowing money to operate and making cuts. At our state colleges and universities, all you need to do is look in the local newspapers around the state and see the cuts that institutions are making because of the inadequate funding provided by the state. So we know that education is the economic engine of the state of Minnesota, and we should be investing there.
Amen.
Keep going. Everybody agree?
Let me just say, we do have an opportunity with the federal tax laws changing of doing more conformity. Minnesota is out of conformity with all kinds of different areas. I want to at least explore that. If we decide we're going to do a constitutional amendment dedicating the sales tax on auto parts, that leaves a hole, so there's an opportunity for that to fill in with surplus money. And then the last thing that comes to mind is pensions. We have an opportunity to fix them, and I'm open to trying to find a way to do that.
Well, I think in one of these hearing rooms recently, we learned about all the challenges that the MNLARS rollout has happened. That's going to require some additional money in order to get that stabilized and that software up and running right. Something I think I read in the $40 million range, something like that. Clearly, we're going to have to put some additional money into the Department of Health. All of these reports about elder abuse and the lack of resources to investigate complaints is really serious. It's probably not large sums of money. And I think then I want to urge some caution that we don't overcommit and potentially create a deficit. But I do think Senator Gazelka is right. We need to fix the problem with our public employee pensions. That needs to be done. I would reserve a large piece of it for one-time spending, just to make sure that we don't overcommit in the next biennium. So I would probably put some of it into cash in a potential bonding bill.
Tom Hauser twisted my arm. He gets the next question.
Tom Hauser from KSTP Television. Oftentimes in election years, legislative sessions become political, driven largely by the elections that are coming up. Mr. Speaker, have you decided whether or not you are running for governor?
I convinced Susan before I came here that no, they're not going to ask that question. I haven't, I'm not actively pursuing it right now, but I haven't completely closed the door, and that's probably the best answer I can give you.
Anybody else going for another office?
I'm running for Speaker.
Who do we have who hasn't asked a question and who doesn't get around here very often? The end, Minnesota Daily.
Michael Ockerling, Minnesota Daily. My question first is for the legislative leaders, and then I have a follow-up for the governor, if that'd be okay. Senator Carla Nelson and Representative Bud Nornes proposed a campus neutrality free speech bill because I believe they feel that conservative speech is being threatened on the University of Minnesota campus. And I was just wondering where the legislative leaders stood on that piece of legislation.
Well, I can tell you I support the legislation. I think if a campus invites somebody that's more liberal or more conservative, they should have the right to share their views, regardless of where they're at. The University of Minnesota, I think, does a reasonable job of doing that. I had a conversation within the last week with President Kaler about a speaker that was coming and making sure that he had as much right to share his views as maybe somebody on the other side. And so, but that doesn't always happen around the country, and I think that's why you see that legislation coming forth.
Yeah, I would support that too. I think, we just want to make sure that folks from both perspectives have the same access to our public universities.
I'm not familiar with the legislation, but I think the First Amendment makes pretty clear we, especially at our public institutions, have to allow all speech.
And my follow-up for the governor is your $1.5 billion public works bill includes $298 million for the University of Minnesota, which is actually $60 million more than the university requested. I was just wondering why you decided to go above and beyond what the university requested. And of those $60 million, you went above and beyond. There was $10 million for a design for a new clinical research facility that the university didn't even ask for. So I was wondering how that got in there.
Well, what the university wants and what they ask for are different numbers. And what they asked for was what they thought the traffic would bear. It's less than what they need. As Senator Bakk said, really all of our state, not all, but good number of our state facilities are seriously in disrepair. And the university and the Minnesota State campuses, you got water dripping from the ceilings in places. So I wanted to make that one of my final priorities. I think higher education funding, as Representative Hortman said, has suffered over the years. We've rebuilt some of that, but in 2012, fiscal 12, state funding for higher education was the lowest it had been in real dollars since 1981. It's successively been reduced. So we're just catching up. And, all of our higher education, everybody says higher education is the future. Well-educated workforce is going to require additional education and sophistication. I mean, if we shortchange that, we shortchange our own future.
Lori Sturdivant, Star Tribune. Hi, everybody. The federal, as several of you have alluded, the federal government has given the tax committees of the legislature a big challenge and a lot of work to do this year as you wrestle with how much to conform to the new federal tax laws. I don't want you to get into the finer points of that because, well, it's complicated, I know, but I wonder what principles, what overarching goals are each of you thinking those tax committees ought to pursue as they tackle that work, thinking about particularly about ideas that are sort of in tension, as I understand it. Simplicity is in tension with revenue neutrality, and it's in tension with whether or not everyone in the state will see a tax no tax increase, or whether some people will see a tax increase. Whether or not our revenues at the state level can stay sustainable if we conform. What kind of marching orders and principles are you giving to the tax committees? And start with Governor Dayton.
I'm not giving any instructions to the tax committee as yet, but your point about the complexity, Commissioner Bowerly, we met for a couple hours yesterday. Her career people in the Revenue Department say this is by far the most complicated and complex bill that they tried to decipher, and they're working with the House and Senate research staff because they all are trying to sort it out. And just to underscore the complexity of it, if we were to conform, we would have people would be earning between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. We would have 152,000 of them would receive average tax increases of $365. 233,000 of them will receive average tax reductions of $113. So it all depends on how you fit within the doubling of the exemption everything else is combined. It's to try to make everybody, if you do nothing, you got to try to make people so they're not getting sizable tax increases. If you conform, you got to try to even that out. I think to try to make it as equitable as possible, especially for working Minnesotans, is really crucial.
So I'll go next. First of all, I want to conform as much as possible. The more we conform to, the simpler Minnesota's tax code will be, just like the federal tax code has become simpler. Secondly, I think the new numbers came in at a little over $600 million a year coming in. I was saying $700 million, but I think they readjusted those numbers. But in the end, I don't want a tax increase on Minnesotans. They're now getting about 90% of them a federal tax reduction. Their W-2s are changing now. They were estimated about 90% have a lower W-2 withholdings. So those are the two really, really big ones. And how we do that is complicated, and that's where we're all, everybody's been working on it, but that's the general direction that I want to go in this matter.
I would say, too, I think conformity is normally what we strive for, and I think we want to conform, but not just for the sake of conforming, because conformity by itself is a huge tax increase on Minnesotans. And I don't know that anybody up here will tell you they want to raise a huge, well, maybe I won't speak for them, they can answer that themselves, but I don't want a huge, you heard the governor talk about some of the people who would get a tax increase. Now is not the time to be increasing taxes on Minnesotans, so the problem is it's very difficult to try to decipher or figure out how to hold everyone harmless. So my goal would be to try to hold people harmless in this bill, to try to pass conformity while giving that extra revenue back to the people that would pay it in. It's almost impossible to put the toothpaste back in the tube there, though. So we'll have to do the best job that we can. And as we do that, I think we need to look at trying to make our tax code more competitive, really trying to incentivize the type of things that we want to happen, and help out people that could use the help.
I hope that we will take the opportunity to balance the tax cuts to benefit middle-class families. 3/4 of the benefits of the federal tax bill go to families making $200,000 a year or more. And I would hope that when we do conformity and make some adjustments in Minnesota's tax structure, that we'll look at those families who aren't getting ahead, who over the last 10 years haven't seen their incomes go up, and that we will weight the tax cuts toward families that are working, struggling to get by, and seniors on fixed incomes, and helping them reduce their property tax burden.
Well, to the extent we can do federal conformity, I support that. I do think, and Senator Gazelka and I have talked about this, I think it's going to take a bipartisan vote in the Senate. And to the extent the overall bill can be revenue neutral, so that we don't increase the tax burden on Minnesotans, I support that, but that's difficult. There are always some winners and losers, and sometimes it takes some additional new money to buy off losers. I think I would argue that maybe that should be one-time spending, where we maybe have to put some one-time money into the bill, provide some help for people, just to be sure that people aren't negatively impacted.
Hey guys, my name is Jim Bunner. I'm with KTTC Television in Rochester, and I know everybody is trying to discuss issues that are all around the state or coming out of St. Paul, but I thought that I might try to localize this a little bit to southeast Minnesota. Housing is getting around to being kind of a, shall we call it, an issue in the Rochester area. A lot of people are finding housing to be pretty expensive to try to buy a house, and I know that recently we just had a public forum with several representatives from St. Paul talking to us about ideas regarding a lot of issues, but housing was one of them. I was wondering, what are some ideas that you guys would have to make housing a little bit more affordable for people in Minnesota? Now, you guys have talked about bipartisanship all afternoon long, so I was wondering if there are any ideas that you guys have been throwing around a little bit, or things that you could agree on making housing a little bit more affordable in Minnesota.
Well, I can offer that there's no fiercer advocate for housing than Representative Alice Hausman from St. Paul, our bonding lead, and she has fought for having a significant portion of the bonding bill have a housing component to bring down the cost of housing, in particular in greater Minnesota. And I would expect that Representative Hausman will bring that fierce fight for housing back to this year's bonding discussion.
I can tell you I had a conversation with Senator Weber. He's from western Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, and he said the two major issues that we have to keep our eye on is housing and daycare. And I'm just saying in rural Minnesota. And one of the things that he brought up has to do with regulations, that we have to be careful how we regulate the construction and what additional costs that we put on it. One example I'll give of that, I believe it was triplexes that we required sprinklers, and basically nobody wanted to build them anymore. We removed that mandate, and I believe construction's moving forward. But, so those are some of the things that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Well, I think the larger problem, this wasn't a problem a few decades ago. I mean, and the problem has evolved over time, and that wages have not kept up with the cost of living. And I think in many areas of the state, employers are having huge challenges finding employees because nobody can come locate there because they can't find housing. So I think that's the big challenge, is how do we, is there anything we can do to incent employers to increase wages some? So otherwise this problem's only going to get worse because the cost of construction continues to go up. And if wages don't keep up, the burden, either people aren't going to have housing or more people are going to be coming to the state looking to supplement or mitigate some of the cost.
From looking at you, Governor, it looked like you had a response to what Senator Gazelka was saying. Do you have some input?
Well, it's a more expensive problem than the state has resources to solve. And down in your area where you're talking about the Destination Medical Center, doubling the employees in the Mayo Clinic, I mean, you're going to have it even more acutely. Part of it is again, we're down to full employment, or 3.1% unemployment. We got, more and more people coming to places where they have job opportunities, and that, the basic law of market economics that drives the prices up, and as Senator Bakk said, people's income is not commensurate with that, then they're priced out of the market. I mean, the targeted money we put into areas like Thief River Falls, where there's a major job expansion there, has been very successful in bringing down some of the costs and encouraging developers to build. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to the totality of the situation in Minnesota. I've set up a task force. I don't have the answers. I want people who have that expertise to talk about what we can do. If it's a matter of lowering regulations or disincentives, then we should look at that. But unfortunately, economic success brings its own challenges, and this is one of the byproducts of a full employment economy.
Next, the uptake.
Straight today, the uptake. Excuse me. So the Minneapolis Public Schools have said that they will be asking the Minnesota legislature for additional funding for special education and English language services. Given your caucuses and the governor's K-12 priorities, what might your response to that deficit and to that request look like?
Well, they're right. Special education, and it starts with the federal government's failure, and it was in the U.S. Senate. 1978, I believe it was, the federal government promised 40% of the cost of special education. It was less than 20% of that when I took office in the Senate. It's dropped down now to about 13, 14%. If we were funding the military at less than half of what it says it needs, we'd have an outcry. So, and that's put the burden onto state and local education expenditures. That's the starting point there, but we need to do all we can to pick up the difference in special education. If you underfund special education, you force school districts and schools to divert resources that are meant for the other students to special education. There's just no way they can meet the requirements. So I would say yes, that should be a top priority.
And the majority and minority leaders?
Last year was our two-year budget, which we passed for K-12 and increased spending over $1 billion. But we have two K-12 chairs, one policy, one finance, Senator Carla Nelson, Senator Eric Pratt. And I'm not sure what they're working on specifically related to Minneapolis and special education. I can't give you an answer beyond that today.
Kyle's been waiting patiently.
Kyle Potter, Associated Press. You've all talked about a potential constitutional amendment to dedicate auto sales taxes. What other constitutional amendments are you discussing to put on the ballot this year, including possible amendments to alter the selection or maybe even the role of the lieutenant governor?
Don't all speak at once.
I can jump in. I think, let me talk about the auto parts sales tax first. We took about half of that, and actually I didn't speak up soon enough on the question about what are your priorities if we have a surplus. I didn't speak on that question. We put about $150 million, I think, or $140 million from the auto parts sales tax, which was approximately half of it, into roads and bridges. If we have enough surplus, I would support going back and getting the other half of that and putting it into roads and bridges. I think that's the kind of investment that our roads and bridges, frankly, need, but it takes a surplus to do that. So that would be something I would support. As far as a constitutional amendment to constitutionally dedicate it, it's not as big a deal for me, but I would be open to it. On the lieutenant governor situation, we haven't really talked about how to deal with that, but I think it would take a constitutional amendment. But I do believe strongly, and I've mentioned to the governor, I believe the governor should be able to choose his own lieutenant governor and appoint his own. And if that takes a Senate confirmation or something, I think that's appropriate. But the governor should be able to choose his own lieutenant governor. Beyond that, I think we have a big problem in what came out of the Supreme Court. They didn't really decide our case about the legislative funding. They just said, you have access to enough money, you can get to session, you all work it out, which has worked, and the court had some wisdom there apparently, because we're gonna handle it on our own. But what they did decide in that case was that the courts in Minnesota cannot step in and appropriate money in the event of a shutdown. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we face. And it's a good government thing, it's not a partisan thing, but I believe very strongly we should figure out how we don't get into a situation where we have a hard shutdown and we're talking about what happens to prisoners on July 1st. Or what happens to senior citizens, or the most vulnerable in our society. I think a good conversation amongst adults about what we can do to remedy that problem, I think would be beneficial. And it may take a constitutional amendment.
Anybody else on the amendments? If not, sexual misconduct has been a major issue, of course, and forced yesterday's special elections. What do you expect to come up on that topic? What do you expect to pass this year, if anything, on that? And also, what type of, talk about the training that you folks, all of you, have instituted. Do you want to start, Governor? Have you made any changes?
Well, Commissioner France headed a group of our the most senior commissioners to look at the situation in the executive branch, and it's we have 33,200 state employees. You have to put that in perspective with the number of incidents, but any one incident is too many. And when they went through the list of the different consequences, the variance from one agency to another was really distressing. We also don't know how many people have not come forward with complaints because they don't feel safe in doing so. So I think the most important recommendation to come out of that was to set up a centralized body, which I frankly would be glad to see share with the legislature, put together the kind of protections, the kind of security, the privacy, and then have people who really develop the expertise to be dealing with these situations to have consequences that are consistent across the spectrum of state government. That and additional training, I think, are the two major recommendations come out of that. We'll have a proposal to the legislature with a modest amount of funding to set up this central office for the executive branch.
You mentioned legislature. Would you want the judicial to be part of this also?
If they'd like to do so.
Okay. For legislature, Senator Gazelka, go ahead.
Let me say, first of all, I've always say, and I still will say, I'm glad the light was shown on this area. I think shine or shone, one of those two. Just because anything that we can get better in this area, we want to. And so in the Senate, we looked at our policy. It hasn't been changed since 1996. So the path that we took for now is that I instructed our nonpartisan staff, our legal counsel, and our HR department, both hired by the other side of the aisle, to begin the process of going through what do we need to change. And there's a number of things that will come forth related to that. I will tell you that the four leaders had an interesting discussion today, all about how do we make this better. All four of us, how do we make this better? There's been a number of directions proposed. I have my particular direction I think we should go. But in the end, I would ask you all to look at what is the fruit that comes out of this. And I think that you'll find that all of us and what we do moving forward will make it a better place to work.
Are you talking about the need for new laws, or are you just talking about internal rules?
More internal. I don't know. Well, depending on what we do with the Legislative Coordinating Commission, we may have to do some things. But the point is, one example, for example, we don't really have a good way to deal with third-party accusations or legitimate complaints. What do we do with those? We don't really have a process. We don't really have a process that lays out exactly how much time between events steps have to be taken. And so just a number of things. And the last thing I'll say is in the situation that happened in the Senate, I will tell you that Senator Bakk and I had conversations. We both said this has to be about making the Senate a better place. It cannot be partisan. If it becomes partisan, then we lose what we're really trying to do here, and that is make it a better place for everyone.
Anything to add, Senator Bakk?
Well, Senator Gazelka and I had a conversation about kind of what's going on in other states. This issue is not unique to Minnesota, as everybody knows. The National Conference of State Legislatures, our umbrella group, has been doing some work in a number of states. I think we've had a conversation about maybe bringing them in and see kind of what's going on in other states. What can we learn from what other states are doing? And I think that could be meaningful. It is a challenging environment because not everybody's under the leader's control in this building, including all of you at that table. And I can remember writing a letter one time to the Government Relations Council, the umbrella group of lobbyists, and writing a letter to them saying, one of your lobbyists was very offensive to a member of the Senate and suggests that they take some kind of disciplinary action within their own group. They have a code of ethics in their manual, but not under our control. So different leaders are going to handle those events not under our control in a different way. And I think a central way to handle those kind of things would be helpful if we could figure that out.
I think I have been very vocal since all of this happened about making sure that we have a safe workplace and environment for lobbyists, for the press, for the public, safe and respectful. The House will have a zero tolerance policy for inappropriate behavior. And I have instituted a mandatory training, as mandatory as I can make it, for members of the legislature. All members will attend on the second day of session a full day of implicit bias training and sexual harassment training, and we're going to have a bipartisan lunch in between. And if members choose not to participate in that, they will be removed from their committee assignments, and they can explain to their constituents why they don't serve on any committees in the House. That's about as firm as I can make it, and if I could think of something more firm, I would do it. But as Senator Bakk said, these members of the legislature don't work for me. I can't fire them, and that's what makes this kind of unique environment. In addition to that, we announced last week that we will have a subcommittee of the Rules Committee in the House that will analyze all of our our internal policies and external issues as well. We will bring in experts and have, in a very transparent, open public hearings, have testimony from people about any concerns that anyone might have or things that we can do to improve the situation. Because what we're striving for is no sexual harassment, is a very comfortable, respectful workplace for everyone. And we won't stop until that happens. So we're taking, I believe, every step that we can to really ensure, and frankly, I think I've probably taken more steps than anyone because I am so serious about this issue. I don't like that kind of behavior, and I personally will not stand for it. So, we are. I think, what Senator Gazelka said, I'll agree with. I think that what has happened in society, not just here in Minnesota, but across the country in recent months is good because it's shining a light on behavior that I think some in the past thought was appropriate, but no one should ever think is appropriate. And we certainly don't want this issue to become politicized, and we're very conscious of that because I think if we politicize this issue, it diminishes the people who are affected and impacted by it. It diminishes the victims, and we can't have that either.
I would like to thank the Speaker for agreeing to my request to have the full-day training on the second day of session. I think that was a very important step. When members get elected, they get a little tiny dose of training when they have their first orientation, but then they're not trained again in the course of their career. I think we do a much better job with staff, and so I really appreciate that we are going to upgrade what we're doing for members because I think members really need that training. I'd also like to thank the Speaker for agreeing to listen to outside experts in the subcommittee and be bringing people in outside of the legislature. One thing that's very clear from what has happened that we're not doing such a hot job of taking care of our internal processes on our own. So we need to listen to the expertise of employment lawyers and human resources professionals from the outside. That's a beginning. I think as we look at this issue, there's 3 areas we really have to address. First, internally, members and staff, making sure they understand the complaint procedures, they understand the rules of the game and what's allowed and what's not allowed, and that they feel confidence in the system. Second, we have to look at the people who come to the Capitol. We have to look at the members of the media and the lobbying community and members of the public and make sure that there is a clear, accessible, fair forum within which they can complain about misconduct. And that's fair to the people who are accused of misconduct, but may in fact not be guilty of misconduct. And then we have to look at all of the workplaces in Minnesota, and we have to ask ourselves whether the current laws are doing what they need to do to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And I would posit that they are not strong enough right now, and they do not provide a means for redress for people in workplaces all across the state. So I'm very hopeful that we'll work together on those 3 aspects. I advocated very forcefully for the establishment of the task force that was requested by the 3 individuals who stepped forward this fall and shared their stories. We're not going in that direction. I think it was an exceedingly reasonable request and would have resulted in some recommendations that could have been very helpful to us, but that is not the direction that we are going. And so we will work in the venues that have been created to try to bring in outsiders and get that perspective through that means.
We're out of time, but I know the 5 of you would like to answer more questions. If there's anyone who came in from Greater Minnesota who has not asked a question yet, now's your chance. Any reporter. This is a really quiet bunch. Anybody else have one final question everybody wants to know about? Kevin does.
Kevin Featherly, Minnesota lawyer. There was a long conversation at the Ways and Means Committee hearing about the possibility of a continuing appropriations bill. Other people were calling it a continuing resolution bill. As a side issue there, they were also arguing whether or not the court was really serious in its message to the legislature about what they will do with funding. I'd like you to get you to respond to both those questions. Was the court really serious about what it was saying with regard to funding? And what do you think about a continuing resolution bill?
Speaker wants to jump in on this.
I can jump in on that. I was the one that talked about it earlier. And what I said was it may take a constitutional amendment. It probably wouldn't. I think we could do it with some sort of continuing appropriation or continuing the previous biennium's appropriation at some diminished level. The idea is you'd want to have it not be so punitive that we were, wheeling senior citizens out of the nursing homes or releasing prisoners onto the streets, but yet there was enough of an incentive that it would still require the legislators to come back to the table and negotiate some sort of ongoing budget. So Democrats in the House introduced last year a bill, and we included it in our omnibus bill actually, but didn't make the final cut in negotiations, but a bill that would continue appropriation at 90% of the previous appropriation. And something like that I think would work. To answer your question directly, I don't want to find out if the court was serious.
I think it's important to look both at the front end of negotiations and at the very end if there's a failure. So I think it's clear that right now the process is broken and there's too much brinksmanship in the closing days of the legislative session. So as we discuss a potential continuing resolution that would have a potential upside for conservatives if we don't have a deal and a potential upside for liberals if we don't have a deal, so each party is incented to stay at the table, we also have to look at the process that happens before we get there. And we really need the 4 legislative leaders and the governor talking about the global budget targets much earlier in the process. We right now are not using the process set out in our state constitution and in the House and Senate rules to have committees do hearings and to have conference committees put bills together and put them on the governor's desk. We have way too much being decided in rooms with the 5 of us sitting down and talking about what should and shouldn't happen, and that is not how the process was designed. So I think we need to look at what we're currently doing to construct the budget and change those front-end procedures. And I'll have a proposal to do that. One of the things we also need to take into account is whether we perhaps need to use the November forecast as a starting point and get going much, much earlier in the session.
Those of us around the table will be happy to sit in on those talks, I think. Anybody else have anything to add?
I think the courts were serious.
Thanks to the 5 of you for coming. We appreciate this. This, as I said at the beginning, this really helps us prepare Minnesotans for what's going to happen in the next few months. We will hopefully be able to continue this in the future, maybe without 1 or 2 of you, but thank you for coming, and Foreign News Service really appreciates your willingness to schedule this, which is not always easy to get the 5 of you together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.